All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Scarlet, pharmacist. The smell of antiseptic and artificially sweetened cherry syrup used to be my world. It was a clean, predictable scent. I knew its contours the way I knew the weight of my wedding band on my finger. But right now, the only thing I can smell is the acrid, metallic scent of panic, and the world has no contours left. It has shattered. Dr. Feldman's office was supposed to be a safe space. Beige walls, a generic painting of a boat on a calm sea, a box of tissues placed precisely equidistant between the two leather chairs. Christopher and I sat in them, a chasm of silence stretching wider than the 18 inches of expensive Persian rug between us. Our 7th anniversary was in 2 weeks. We were here for preventative maintenance, he'd said, to future-proof our happiness. He held his phone in his lap, his thumb nervously stroking the edge of the case. And Scarlett, Dr. Feldman said, turning her kind, analytical eyes to me. How have you been feeling about the quality of your connection these past few weeks? I opened my mouth to give my rehearsed, brittle answer about being busy at the pharmacy and the universal tiredness of parenting a 6-year-old. But our friend, Lisa, who had recommended Dr. Feldman, chose that exact moment to send a text. Christopher's phone lit up on his lap. A preview of the message flashed on the screen. Lisa, hey, just left the club. Jamie says he's sorry for almost getting you caught last weekend with that charge. At the rest was cut off. Jamie, his golf instructor. The one he'd been spending every Saturday morning with for the past 6 months. The one who had revolutionized his drive. Caught. Charge. The words weren't processed in my brain, they were felt like a physical blow to the sternum, a sudden vacuum that stole all the air from my lungs. My entire body went cold, then unbearably hot. The clean, predictable world of my pharmacy tilted on its axis and vomited its contents onto this beige rug. Christopher flinched. Not because of the text, but because he saw my face. He saw the exact moment I read it. His hand jerked, a frantic, guilty movement to flip the phone over to hide the evidence. That flinch, that was the confirmation. It was a punctuation mark on a sentence of betrayal I hadn't even known was being written. Scarlett? Dr. Feldman's voice was distant, muffled, as if I were submerged in water. All I could see was Christopher's hand. The hand I'd held at the altar. The hand that had held mine through a 36-hour labor with our daughter. Now it was a traitor's hand, desperately hiding a secret from his mistress. My mouth was desert dry. The details of the room hyper-focused, each one a fresh cut. The stupid boat in the painting was sailing in a storm now. The tissue box was a monument to a grief I hadn't even begun to touch. What charge? The words came out of me, a raspy, foreign sound. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Christopher's face paled to the color of the unopened tissues. Scarlett, it's out of context. I can explain. What charge it where, Christopher? My voice was louder now, shaking with a seismic force I couldn't control. The professional facade of the therapy room cracked, and raw, unfiltered pain poured into the space. What did you almost get caught doing? He just stared, his mouth a thin, helpless line. His silence was louder than any confession. It was a wall of concrete, slamming down between us. I saw it all then. The extra overtime. The new, more energetic attitude he'd attributed to finally breaking 90. The way he'd been distant in bed, his kisses feeling like obligations. The pieces of the last 6 months spun in the air like shrapnel and then slammed into place, forming a picture so ugly it made me nauseous. I stood up. My legs held me, but just barely. I was a column of pure, trembling shock. I looked at Dr. Feldman, her professional composure finally fractured into concern. I looked at my husband, the stranger in the leather chair. Future-proof our happiness, I said, the phrase tasting like ash. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep, too shocking for tears. It was a silent, internal scream that was turning my bones to dust. I walked out. I left him there, in that safe, beige room with his secrets and his flinching hands. I walked out of the office building into the blinding afternoon sun, and the world had not ended. Cars still passed. People laughed on the street corner. The universe was grotesquely, violently indifferent to the fact that my life had just ended in a therapist's office, betrayed by a text message preview and a guilty flinch. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white monuments. I was a pharmacist. I dealt in precise measurements, in chemical reactions with predictable outcomes. There was no equation for this, no pill I could dispense to unknow this truth. The foundation of everything I was, everything I had built, was not just cracked, it had been vaporized. And all that was left was the echoing, silent aftershock of a single, betraying flinch. The drive home was a blackout. I have no memory of the streets, the traffic lights, the turns. My body operated the car on a primal, autonomic level, while my mind was a roaring static of fragmented images. The boat painting, the beige rug, the flinch, that damn flinch. It played on a loop behind my eyes, a 2-second horror film that reset and started over every time I blinked. I pulled into the driveway of our Georgian-style home, a house we'd bought 2 years ago because Christopher said it spoke of stability, of a future. The windows looked like blank, dead eyes. I killed the engine and the silence was immediate and absolute. It was the silence of a crime scene. I walked inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Clean, orderly, a testament to a life I now understood was a carefully constructed diorama. Chloe's tiny rain boots were lined up by the door. A drawing of our family, 3 stick figures with giant, smiling heads, was taped to the refrigerator. The sight of it was a physical pain, a knife twisted in the wound. I looked at the smiling stickman labeled Daddy and felt vomit rise in my throat. I didn't know what to do. There was no protocol for this. There's no chapter in the pharmacist's handbook titled What to Do When Your Life Explodes. My training was in controlled substances, in measured responses. This was chaos in its purest form, so I did the only thing that made sense. I went to the one place in the house that was unequivocally, solely mine. My bathroom. It was my sanctuary. The cool marble countertops, the deep soaking tub, the expensive orchid by the sink that I kept alive through sheer willpower. I locked the door and stood there, my back against it, breathing in the familiar scent of my jasmine soap. This was where I came after a long day of dealing with insurance claims and irritable customers. This was where I'd cried happy tears looking at a positive pregnancy test. This was where the mask came off. And now, the mask wasn't just off. It had been incinerated. I moved to the sink, gripping the cool marble. I looked at myself in the mirror. Scarlett the pharmacist, Scarlett the wife, Scarlett the mother. Who was I now? The betrayed woman, the cliché. My reflection offered no answers, just a pale face with hollow, shocked eyes. The front door opened and closed. Footsteps in the hallway, heavy, hesitant. Scarlett? His voice was tentative, frayed with guilt. I didn't answer, I couldn't. My vocal cords were frozen. Scarlett, please, let's talk, let me explain. He was outside the door now. I could hear the soft thud of his forehead resting against the wood. Explain. What explanation could possibly fit? What combination of words could form a compound stable enough to neutralize the acid he'd poured onto our life? Go away, Christopher. The words were barely a whisper, but they carried through the door. I can't, please. Open the door, his voice broke. It's not what you think. A hysterical, bitter laugh escaped me. It was a raw, ugly sound. Not what I think. I think you're fucking your golf pro, Christopher. I think you took her to a restaurant and put it on our credit card. I think our mutual friend knows all about it. What exactly am I thinking wrong? The silence on the other side of the door was his confession. It was more damning than any answer. Then a soft, small voice. Mommy? My heart stopped. Chloe, she was home from her playdate. I heard Christopher's hurried shuffle away from the door. Hey, sweet Bia. How was Maya's house? I unlocked the door and yanked it open. My daughter stood there, her little face looking between us, sensing the storm in the air. I forced a smile onto my face, a feat of acting I didn't know I possessed. It felt like cracking glass. It was good, Daddy, we made bracelets. She held up her wrist, adorned with a clumpy, colorful plastic bracelet. Where's Mommy's smile? The innocence of the question shattered me. I dropped to my knees and pulled her into a hug, burying my face in her hair, inhaling the scent of strawberry shampoo and little girl. It was the only pure thing left in this house. Mommy just has a little headache, my love, I whispered, my voice thick. How about you go pick out a movie for us to watch? Daddy and I need to talk for a minute. She skipped off, happily oblivious. The moment she was out of sight, the glass smile vanished from my face. I stood up and turned to Christopher. The grief was gone, burned away by a cold, incandescent rage. "You will not do this in front of her," I said, my voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the tremor in my hands. "You will not taint her with your filth." "Scarlett, it was a mistake," he began, his hands out, pleading. "A mistake," I cut him off, advancing on him. "Is that what you call it? A mistake is putting salt in your coffee instead of sugar. A mistake is forgetting to buy milk. You don't accidentally fuck another woman for 6 months, Christopher. You don't accidentally look your wife in the eye every day and lie to her." The dam broke. The questions, the details I didn't want to know but had to ask, came pouring out of me in a torrent of pain. "Was it in our bed? Did you think of me? Of her? When you were with me, were you thinking of her? Did you tell her you loved her? Did you laugh about me, the stupid, clueless wife?" Each question was a lash, and with each one he shrunk smaller. He didn't answer. He just stood there, taking it, his silence confirming every horrific scenario my mind could conjure. The climax wasn't loud. It was a quiet, devastating realization that settled in the space between us after my torrent of words had faded. I looked at this man, this stranger I had built a life with, and I felt nothing. The love was gone, scraped out of me, leaving a hollow, aching void. The rage flickered and died, leaving behind the cold ashes of absolute truth. "I want you to leave," I said, my voice flat, empty. "Now, take a bag, go to a hotel, I don't care where, but you don't get to stay here. You lost that right." He looked stunned. "Scarlett, this is my house too. We need to talk about this like adults, for Chloe's sake." "Do not," I hissed, the fury flashing back for one final, brilliant moment, "use our daughter as a shield for your behavior. Get out." I turned my back on him. I walked away from the wreckage of my marriage, down the hall toward the living room where my daughter was waiting with a Disney movie. I left him standing there in the ruins of the life he'd chosen to blow up. With every step, the coldness in my chest spread. I was a pharmacist. I knew about numbing agents. This was the emotional equivalent, a total anesthetic for the heart. I sat on the couch and pulled Chloe into my lap, holding her tight as the colorful opening credits began to play. I felt the vibration of the garage door opening, then closing. He was gone. The movie played. Princesses sang. And I just sat there, holding my daughter, staring at a screen I couldn't see, realizing the hardest truth of all. The man I had loved was gone. He had been gone for months. And I was now alone in the home we'd built, surrounded by the ghost of a life that had never been real. The silence he left behind was a living thing. It wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, and it sucked all the sound and warmth out of the house, leaving only the hollow echo of my own breathing. For 3 days, I moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting my own life. I performed the necessary rituals. I made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I read bedtime stories about brave princesses. I answered the pharmacy's calls about shift coverage with a voice so professionally calm it surprised even me. I was a shell, expertly going through the motions, while inside, a nuclear winter had settled. My mind had become a detective against my will, a morbid archaeologist excavating the ruins of my marriage. I didn't want the truth, but my brain, in its cruel, self-flagellating efficiency, demanded it. It replayed every moment of the last 6 months, every late night at the office, every Saturday morning lesson that now stretched into afternoon practice sessions. I was a licensed pharmacist, trained to spot interactions and contraindications, and I had missed the most dangerous interaction of all happening right in front of me. The compulsion started on the 4th day. Chloe was at school. The house was too quiet. The silence was screaming at me, and the only way to silence it was to find more evidence. I needed to make the phantom pain real, to touch the source of the infection. I went into his office, a room I rarely entered, a shrine to his corporate ambitions and, as I now knew, his deceptions. The air smelled like him, his cologne, and it made my stomach turn. I sat in his expensive ergonomic chair, the leather cold beneath me. His computer was password protected, a new development from about 5 months ago. Security protocols from it, he'd said. I'd nodded, stupidly, trustingly, but I was a ghost in his machine now. I began with the physical world. I opened his desk drawers. Receipts, old business cards, a spare charging cable. It was all mundane, innocent. Then, the bottom drawer, locked. A small, flimsy lock meant to keep out curious children, not a wife with a heart full of shrapnel. I found a letter opener in the top drawer and jimmied it. The cheap mechanism gave way with a satisfying snap. Inside, there was a manila envelope. My hands were trembling. This was it. The part of the horror movie where the protagonist opens the door they should leave closed. I dumped the contents onto his pristine desk. A receipt fell out first. The Sand Trap Grill, dated a Saturday 2 months ago. For two glasses of Pinot Noir, 2 orders of the sea bass. He'd told me he'd grabbed a hot dog at the clubhouse. I remembered that night. He'd come home late, kissed my cheek, and I'd smelled the faintest trace of garlic and wine on his breath. Long game, he'd mumbled. I'd believed him. Next, a scorecard from the golf course. Scribbled in the margin, in a loopy, feminine handwriting that was not mine. Your swing is a work of art. I felt a hot wave of nausea. My professional, analytical mind tried to compartmentalize it. Just words on paper. Just ink. But they were incendiary devices. Then, the photographs. They were casual, printed on glossy photo paper. Christopher, smiling that easy, relaxed smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. He had his arm around a woman, tan, athletic, with long blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. Jamie, not just a name in a text anymore. A face. A body, a person he chose over me. They were standing on a green, squinting in the sun. In another, they were at a bar, leaning into each other, laughing. The intimacy in their body language was a physical blow. It was the laughter that undid me. It looked so effortless, so free. The laughter we used to have. I sat there, in his chair, surrounded by the paper trail of my own betrayal. The cold numbness that had protected me for days cracked open, and what poured out was a grief so vast it had its own gravity. It wasn't just about the sex. It was about the laughter, the secret jokes. The second life. He hadn't just shared his body. He'd shared his joy, his ease, his sunlight, and left me with the drudgery of bills and parenting and domestic logistics. A sound escaped me, a raw, guttural sob that seemed to tear its way up from a place I didn't know existed. I swept my arm across the desk, sending the receipts, the scorecard, the photographs flying. They fluttered to the ground like poisonous leaves. I put my head in my hands and cried. I cried for the lost years, for the broken trust, for the stupid, trusting woman I had been. I cried for my daughter, whose picture-perfect family was now just a lie told with stick figures. I cried until I was empty, until my head throbbed and my eyes were raw. The storm passed, leaving a strange, crystalline calm in its wake. The evidence was real. The pain was real. I could no longer pretend. I gathered the scattered pieces of his other life. I didn't put them back in the envelope. I carried them with me into the kitchen. I stood there, holding the photograph of them laughing, and I looked around my home. My home. It was filled with his things, his choices, the ghost of his presence. The neutral grays and blues he'd picked. The modern art prints that were more his style than mine. The entire house was a monument to a man who no longer existed, to a partnership that was a fraud. The numbness was gone, burned away by the tears. In its place was a single, clear, furious imperative. Erase him. I didn't plan it. It was a biological response. I went to the garage and found the painting supplies, the leftover cans from when we'd moved in. I didn't change my clothes. I didn't put down drop cloths. I marched back into the living room, pried open a can of a color called Seaside Villa with a screwdriver, and I dipped a brush in. The first stroke was a violent slash of cream yellow across the sober gray wall. It was messy, reckless, cathartic. With every broad, sweeping stroke, I was painting over the memory of him. I was covering his choices, his dominance, his lies. I painted around the furniture, not bothering to move it. Spots of paint flecked onto the sofa, the rug. I didn't care. For the first time since I'd seen that text, I was feeling something other than soul-crushing pain. I was feeling power. A messy, deranged, glorious power. I painted until my arms ached. I moved from room to room, a woman possessed, turning his somber palette into a riot of sunlit yellow, soft sea green, a bold accent wall of coral. I was redecorating my prison into a place I could maybe, one day, breathe in again. When I finally stopped, the house was a disaster zone. I was splattered in paint, my hair a mess, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the wildly colored walls. I looked at the chaos I had created. It was insane. It was perfect. The doorbell rang. My heart leapt into my throat. Christopher, He'd come back. He'd seen this insanity and he'd come back to confront me. A part of me, the part that was still running on pure adrenaline, welcomed it. I yanked the door open, paintbrush in hand like a weapon, ready for a fight. But it wasn't Christopher. It was my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, holding a still-warm apple pie. Her eyes widened, taking in my disheveled appearance, the splatters of paint, the visible chaos behind me. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice soft with surprise, not judgment. "Spring cleaning?" I looked from her kind, confused face to the pie, a gesture of normalcy and community, and then back at the technicolor war zone of my living room. The absurdity of it all, the contrast between her simple, sweet offering and the cataclysm of my life, hit me. A sound burst out of me. It wasn't a sob. It wasn't a laugh. It was something in between, a hysterical, gasping release. Mrs. Gable simply smiled a little sadly and held out the pie. "It's always the right season for a fresh start, honey." She handed me the pie, turned, and walked back to her own sane, orderly house. I closed the door, holding the warm pie plate, standing in the doorway of my beautiful, insane mess. I was still lost. I was still broken. But for the first time, the path forward, however messy and nonlinear, felt like my own. The paint on the walls dried, but the chaos inside me remained wet, sticky, and unresolved. The vibrant yellow of the living room was a lie. It screamed optimism and sunshine, but it felt like a desperate, manic scream into a void. I'd painted over the color, but I couldn't paint over the problem. The problem had a name, a social security number, and a lawyer. His name was Robert Tannenbaum. His retainer fee was a number that made my pharmacist's salary recoil in horror. Sitting across from him, in an office that made Dr. Feldman's look quaint, I felt like a specimen under glass. My life had been reduced to a series of assets and liabilities, a balance sheet of heartbreak. "The key," Mr. Tannenbaum said, steepling his fingers, "is to approach this not as an emotional event, but as a business transaction. A dissolution of a partnership." His voice was calm, measured, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. He might as well have been discussing the weather. "We'll be seeking primary physical custody, of course, with Christopher receiving standard visitation. Given the cause for the separation, we have significant leverage." I flinched at the word visitation. It made my daughter sound like a library book he got to check out on weekends. Christopher had already agreed to move out, but the legal machinery was just beginning to grind. It was cold, impersonal, and it made everything feel 1,000 times worse. "He's her father," I said, my voice small in the vast, mahogany-paneled room. I don't want to use her as leverage." "It's not about using her, Miss Evans," Tannenbaum corrected gently but firmly. "It's about protecting her stability. And yours. Now, let's discuss the marital home. You wish to retain it?" I looked down at the preliminary documents in front of me. Words jumped out. Equitable distribution, spousal support, marital asset. Our life, our love, our years together, distilled into this sterile, terrifying legalese. Every sentence was a paper cut, a tiny, precise slice that bled me dry of any remaining sentiment. "Yes," I whispered, "it's my daughter's home." "Very well, we'll need to get it appraised. Given the recent alterations," he said, with a barely perceptible glance at the paint smudge still on my wrist, "that should be interesting." The meeting was a blur of numbers and strategies. I signed where he pointed, my hand trembling. I was partitioning my life, selling off the pieces of a dream that had curdled into a nightmare. It felt less like a divorce and more like an autopsy. The true horror, however, wasn't in the lawyer's office. It was in the conversations that followed. I had to tell people. I had to make it real by saying the words out loud. I started with my parents. My mother answered on the first ring. "Scarlett, honey, how's my girl?" I opened my mouth and nothing came out. How do you say it? How do you tell the people who loved your husband, who welcomed him into their family, that it was all a lie? "Mom," the word cracked. "Christopher, there's someone else." The silence on the other end was absolute. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "Oh, baby, no, oh, my sweet girl." Her voice was thick with instant, shared pain. "Are you sure? Maybe it's a misunderstanding?" "I'm sure, Mom." The story tumbled out of me in a choked rush. The therapy session, the text, the flinch, the photos. Saying it aloud to her made it real in a way the lawyer's office hadn't. It was no longer my private hell. It was a family tragedy. My father got on the line, his voice a low, furious rumble. "That boy, I'll have a word with him. I swear to God, Scarlett." His anger was a shield, a defense against the hurt. They offered to come right away, to help with Chloe, to just be there. I told them not yet. I needed to stand on my own 2 feet, even if they were shaking. Then came the worst one. My best friend, Sarah. The one who'd been a bridesmaid in our wedding. The one who'd held my hand through childbirth. I met her at a coffee shop, a neutral ground. The second she saw my face, she knew. "Scar," she said, reaching across the table. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" I told her. The words were ash in my mouth. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Her face didn't crumple in sympathy. Instead, it froze. A strange, guilty look flashed in her eyes there and gone so fast I almost missed it. She pulled her hand back. "Oh, Scarlett," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too tight. That's awful, I'm so sorry." But the hesitation was there. The micro-expression of what? Knowledge. The climax of the scene didn't happen in a shouting match or a tearful confession. It happened in the quiet of my car later that night, my mind replaying Sarah's reaction over and over. That flicker of guilt, that lack of surprise. A cold dread seeped into my bones. I grabbed my phone, my hands ice cold, and I did the thing I knew would finally break me completely. I typed her name into Christopher's social media search bar. Sarah, and there he was, commenting on her photos from months ago, inside jokes I didn't understand. A picture of them all at a happy hour I'd missed because I'd had to pick up Chloe. Him and Sarah, standing close, her head tilted toward him, laughing, she knew. She had to have known. Maybe not the specifics, but the vibe, the change in him, and she'd said nothing. She'd sat in my kitchen, drinking my wine, listening to me worry about why my husband was distant, and she'd said nothing. The betrayal wasn't a single knife anymore. It was a cluster bomb. It wasn't just my husband. It was my friend. My support system. The infrastructure of my life was not just damaged, it was compromised at the core. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat as if it had burned me. I stared out the windshield at the dark, empty street. The realization was a cold, hard stone in my gut. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. This wasn't a battle I could fight with a lawyer or a can of paint. This was a silent, solitary war of attrition against my own history, my own trust, my own naivety. I had started this process thinking I was dissolving a marriage. I was ending a partnership. But I was wrong. I was performing an exorcism, and I was learning that the demons weren't just his. They were the ghosts of my own poor judgment, the echoes of trust I never should have given, the friendly faces that hid silent disloyalty. I started the car. The engine purred to life. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to move. I had to outrun the silence, the paperwork, the pitying looks, the knowing glances of friends who might have known all along. I was a pharmacist, a scientist. I believed in facts, in evidence. And the evidence now suggested that the world was not a safe place. That love was a chemical lie. That friendship was a convenient fiction. The only truth left was the road in front of me and the devastating, absolute solitude inside the car. The divorce wasn't just happening in a lawyer's office. It was happening in here, in the quiet, cavernous space of my own chest, where a heart that used to love and trust was now just a pump, pushing blood through a body that had forgotten how to feel anything but a vast, howling emptiness. The world had become a series of meticulously performed tasks. I was a machine, an automaton programmed to dispense medication, to make school lunches, to nod and smile at neighbors. The divorce papers were signed, a temporary custody arrangement was in place, and the house, with its defiantly cheerful walls, was officially mine. On paper, I was moving on. Inside, I was a glacier, immense, frozen, and slowly carving a canyon of silence through my own life. The pharmacy, my former sanctuary of order and logic, had become a minefield. Every interaction required a Herculean effort. A man buying flowers would make me wonder if they were for his wife or his mistress. A young couple holding hands while waiting for a prescription would send a bolt of pure, undiluted agony through me. I was surrounded by the raw materials of health and healing, and I was utterly, irreparably broken. The breaking point was small, insignificant. It was a Tuesday. I was filling a script for Mrs. Gable, my apple pie-bearing neighbor. Metoprolol, a common beta blocker. I'd filled it a dozen times before. My hands moved on autopilot, counting the pills, slapping the label on the vial. My mind, however, was 1,000 miles away, trapped in a memory of a Saturday morning that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. "Here you go, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice the pleasant, professional monotone I'd perfected. "Same as always." She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "You're a lifesaver, dear. I don't know what I'd do without you." She paid and left. It was only an hour later, during a lull, that my eyes drifted to the prescription log on the computer screen. My blood ran cold. Evans, Scarlett, metoprolol 50 mg, dispensed 100 tablets. I had filled my own prescription under Mrs. Gable's name. It was a mistake. A stupid, careless, potentially dangerous mistake. The kind of mistake a first-year pharmacy student wouldn't make. The kind of mistake that could cost me my license. My hands began to shake. I rushed to the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs, and called Mrs. Gable, my voice trembling as I explained the mix-up, begging her to bring the pills back. She was gracious, of course. "Goodness, dear, don't you worry, we all have off days." But her kindness was salt in the wound. I wasn't having an off day. My entire life was an off day. I was a catastrophic failure as a wife, a failure as a friend, and now I was failing at the one thing I had left: my profession. My boss, a kindly man named Frank, called me into his office after Mrs. Gable had returned the medication. "Scarlett," he said, his voice heavy with concern, "this is the third near miss this month. I've overlooked the others, but this is serious." "I know," I whispered, staring at my hands clenched in my lap. "I'm so sorry, Frank. I'm going through." "I know you are," he said softly. He knew about the divorce. "But I can't have mistakes like this in my pharmacy. The liability, I need you to take some time. A week. Paid. Get your head straight. See a therapist. Do some yoga. Whatever it is you need to do to come back to me whole." He was being more than fair. He was saving my career by temporarily ending it. I nodded, numb, humiliated. I gathered my things and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. I had nowhere to go. The thought of returning to my empty, brightly colored house was suffocating, so I drove. I pointed the car west, toward the coast, and I just drove. The rhythmic thump of the tires on the highway was a dull echo of the mantra in my head: failure, failure, failure. I ended up at a cliffside overlook, a place Christopher and I had come to once, a lifetime ago. The wind whipped my hair around my face, sharp and cold. The Pacific Ocean stretched out to the horizon, a vast, gray, churning expanse of nothingness. It mirrored the void inside me perfectly. This was the bottom. This was the icy, hard reality of rock bottom. It wasn't dramatic. It was this: sitting alone in my car, having been put on leave from the only identity I had left because my pain had made me a danger to others. I had to do something. I couldn't just shatter. I had a daughter who needed a mother who wasn't a ghost, a danger, a failure. The yoga. Frank had said it offhandedly, but it was the only thing that stuck. I needed to move. I needed to force my body to do something my mind couldn't yet comprehend: find stillness. I drove to a sports store and bought the cheapest yoga mat I could find. I didn't go to a class. The thought of being in a room with other people, with their serene faces and flexible bodies, was unbearable. I went home, waited for Chloe to be picked up for her weekend with Christopher, and then I unrolled the mat in the middle of my chaotic living room. I found a beginner's video on my laptop. A woman with a calm voice and impossible posture appeared on the screen. "Welcome," she said serenely. "Let's begin by simply connecting with our breath." I stood on the mat, feeling ridiculous. My breath was a ragged, broken thing. It hitched in my chest. I tried to follow along. Downward dog. My hamstrings screamed in protest. My arms trembled. I collapsed into a heap on the mat, frustrated tears springing to my eyes. I couldn't even do this. I couldn't even breathe correctly. But the woman on the screen kept talking. "Meet yourself where you are," she said. "Without judgment. Without judgment." The words sliced through my self-pity. I wasn't failing at yoga. I was just where I was, a broken woman on a purple mat in a messy living room. I got back up. I tried again. I fell again, and again. For 30 minutes, I fought a silent, brutal war with my own body, with my own breath, with the part of me that wanted to give up. I wasn't graceful. I wasn't serene. I was grunting, sweating, crying, but I was moving. I was forcing air in and out of my lungs with intention for the first time in months. At the end of the video, during the final relaxation, I lay flat on my back on the mat, my body thrumming with exertion. The tears that came now weren't from frustration or grief. They were from exhaustion and something else. A tiny, almost imperceptible fissure in the glacier. It wasn't healing. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was simpler than that. It was the realization that for 30 minutes, I hadn't thought about Christopher. I hadn't thought about the divorce. I hadn't thought about the humiliating mistake at work. I had only thought about my trembling quadriceps and whether my palm was planted flat on the mat. It was the first moment of peace I'd had since the beige room. It was awful, and it was hard, and it was the most honest thing I'd done in a year. I lay there until the light faded from the room, until the video ended and the screen went dark. The silence of the house felt different. It wasn't a vacuum anymore, it was just space. Empty space that I had, for one single, fleeting moment, managed to fill with something other than pain. It was a start. A pathetic, sweaty, tear-stained start, but it was mine. The purple mat became an island in the sea of my grief. Every morning, after I dropped Chloe off at school, I would return to it. The ritual was no longer a suggestion, it was a prescription. One I wrote for myself, 30 minutes. Sometimes 45. The laptop screen glowed in the quiet living room, the serene instructor's voice a gentle counterpoint to the storm still raging inside me. It was awful at first. My body, a pharmacist's body, was built for standing behind a counter, not for folding itself into a pretzel pose. My hips were tight with stored tension, my shoulders a knot of stress I'd been carrying for years. Each session was a battle. I'd sweat and strain, my muscles screaming in protest, my mind a torrent of angry, resentful thoughts. This is stupid. This won't fix anything. He's probably on a golf course right now, laughing. But I kept showing up. I did it because Frank had told me to. I did it because I had nothing else. Mostly, I did it because the 30 minutes of focused agony was still better than the 23 and a half hours of formless, free-floating despair. Slowly, imperceptibly, the island began to grow. The first sign wasn't physical, it was mental. One Tuesday, about 3 weeks in, I was holding a warrior ii pose, my thighs burning, my arms trembling. The instructor's voice filtered through my focus. Find your breath, let it anchor you. And for a split second, I did. I stopped fighting the burn and just breathed into it. The thought that followed wasn't about Christopher. It was a sudden, crystal-clear memory of my daughter's laughter from the night before, a pure, unfiltered sound of joy as we'd built a blanket fort. The pose still hurt. But for that 1 second, the pain was just a sensation. It wasn't a metaphor for my entire existence. It was a tiny crack, but light poured through it. The physical changes followed. I could hold downward dog for 10 full breaths without collapsing. I could touch my toes without bending my knees. The tightness in my hips began to ease. It was a foreign feeling, this awareness of my own body not as a traitorous vessel of pain, but as a capable, responsive instrument. I started sleeping through the night. The frantic, anxious energy that had plagued me began to settle. My return to the pharmacy was tentative. Frank greeted me with a cautious smile. "You look better," he said, and it was the greatest compliment I'd received in a year. I was better, not healed, but better. The colors of the pills in their bins seemed brighter. The beeps and whirs of the machinery were sounds of order, not anxiety. I filled prescriptions with a steadier hand. I didn't make any mistakes. The true test came on a rainy Thursday. Christopher was picking up Chloe for the weekend. I dressed carefully, not for him, but for me, jeans and a simple sweater. My hair was down. I looked like myself, or a version of myself I was starting to recognize again. His car pulled into the driveway. My heart did its familiar, painful squeeze. I braced myself for the wave of nausea, the crippling anger. It didn't come. Oh, the pain was there. A dull, familiar ache, but it was manageable, like an old injury acting up in the rain. I watched him get out of the car, his shoulders hunched against the drizzle. He looked smaller to me, just a man, a flawed, weak man who had made a series of terrible choices. I opened the door before he could ring the bell. Chloe barreled past me with her overnight bag. "Daddy? Hey, pumpkin." He scooped her up, his eyes meeting mine over her head. They were full of the same guilt, the same pleading hope for absolution I'd come to know so well. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Hey," I replied. My voice didn't shake. There was a moment of awkward silence, filled only by the sound of rain on the porch roof. The old me would have filled it with accusations or tears. The new me just stood there, breathing. I felt the solid floor beneath my feet. I felt the steady, calm rhythm of my own heart. The yoga hadn't just taught me how to stretch. It had taught me how to stand my ground without throwing a punch. "She's had dinner," I said, my tone neutral, informative. "Her pajamas are in the bag. Don't let her have sugar after 7 or she won't sleep." He blinked, surprised by my calmness. He was braced for a hurricane and got a steady, gentle rain. "Okay, yeah, sure." I kissed Chloe goodbye. "Have fun, my love." I watched them drive away, the red taillights disappearing into the gray drizzle. I closed the door and leaned against it. The house was silent again, but the silence was different. I didn't crumble. I didn't rage paint a wall. I didn't even cry. I walked into the living room, unrolled my purple mat, and did my sun salutations. The movements were fluid now, familiar. My breath synced with the motion. In, arms up. Out, fold forward. In, flat back. Out, step back. As I moved, I realized something. The hatred, the all-consuming rage I'd felt for Christopher, it was gone. It had burned itself out, leaving behind something else. Not forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever, but a profound, bone-deep indifference. His choices, his life, his guilt, they were his to carry. They were no longer mine. I had carried them for months. I had let his betrayal become the central fact of my existence. But on that mat, in the quiet of my own home, with the rain pattering against the window, I set them down. The climax of my grief wasn't a scream, it was a sigh. A long, slow exhalation of a poison I'd been holding in for far too long. After my practice, I felt light. Empty, but in a good way. Like a room that had been cleared of rotten furniture, ready for something new. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, looking out at my rain-soaked garden. For the first time, the future didn't look like a terrifying, blank expanse. It looked like a quiet afternoon. It looked like the next pose to learn. It looked like the possibility of a night's sleep. I was a pharmacist. I understood the power of incremental doses. A little bit every day until the body adjusts, until healing becomes a habit. I wasn't fixed, but I was no longer broken. I was in repair. And for now, that was enough. The new rhythm of my life was a fragile thing, a delicate melody played on a single string. Work, yoga, Chloe, the 3 pillars holding up my world. I had started venturing out of the house for my practice, trading the living room mat for a real studio. The Sunrise Vinyasa class was my new religion. It was filled with other quiet souls, all of us moving and breathing in unison, seeking something we couldn't name. For that hour, I wasn't a betrayed wife or a single mother. I was just a body, stretching toward the light. It was on my way home from one of these classes, the morning sun warm on my face, that it happened. The universe, which had spent the last few months bludgeoning me with emotional sledgehammers, decided to try a literal one. I was stopped at a red light, feeling the pleasant ache in my shoulders from a particularly deep pigeon pose. I was calm. I was present. I was thinking about what to make for dinner. The light turned green. I eased my foot off the brake. The impact was instantaneous. A violent, deafening crunch of metal and glass. My head snapped forward, then whipped back against the headrest. The world became a spinning, screaming blur of force and noise. My coffee mug flew from the cup holder, exploding against the windshield in a spray of brown liquid and ceramic shards. Time didn't slow down. It fractured. There was a moment of absolute, stunning silence after the car came to a rest, crooked across the intersection. Then the cacophony rushed in. The frantic hiss of a ruptured radiator, the blare of a car horn, my head was resting on the steering wheel, activating it. The distant, rising wail of sirens, smell. That was the first sense that returned with horrifying clarity. The acrid, bitter smell of deployed airbags, the sweet, nauseating scent of antifreeze, and underneath it all, the coppery, terrifying smell of blood. My blood. I could feel a warm trickle down my temple. Chloe. The thought was a lightning bolt of pure, undiluted terror. She was safe, at school. She wasn't in the car. The relief was so profound it made me dizzy, or maybe that was the concussion. Hey, can you hear me? A man's face appeared at my shattered driver's side window. His eyes were wide with alarm. Don't move, the ambulance is almost here, just stay still. I tried to nod, but a sharp, stabbing pain in my neck made me gasp. I was trapped. The door was crumpled inward, pinning my legs. The reality of the situation crashed down on me with more force than the other car had. I could die here. In this intersection, in this metal coffin that used to be my sedan, on a random Tuesday morning. The panic started then, a cold, rising tide in my chest. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with dust and chemicals. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was it. After surviving the emotional wreckage of my marriage, I was going to be killed by a random T-bone collision. The absurdity of it was almost funny. The sirens grew deafeningly loud. Red and blue lights strobed through the cracked glass, painting the interior of the car in frantic pulses. Shadows moved outside my window. Then, a new face appeared. Calmer than the first. Authoritative, he didn't just look at the car. He looked at me. His eyes, a clear, steady blue, assessed the situation in a second. He was wearing a firefighter's turnout gear, the yellow stripes reflecting the flashing lights. "Ma'am," his voice was low, calm, a rock in the middle of my screaming panic. "My name is Ben. We're gonna get you out of there, okay? Just keep looking at me. Can you do that?" I couldn't speak. My throat was closed with fear. But I locked my eyes onto his. They were my lifeline. He directed his crew with quiet, confident commands. "Jaws of life on this side. C-spine precautions. Let's stabilize the vehicle." The world outside my window became a ballet of controlled chaos. The shriek of hydraulic tools, the shouts of other first responders, the crunch of metal being peeled back. But Ben stayed with me. His face was in the window, his voice a constant, calm murmur. "You're doing great, just breathe, in and out. They're almost through, almost there." He was asking me questions, keeping me conscious. "What's your name?" "SC Scarlett," I managed to rasp. "Scarlett, that's a good name. Strong. My daughter's name is Lily. You got any kids, Scarlett?" A girl, Chloe. Saying her name made fresh tears well up. What if I never saw her again? "I bet she's tough, just like her mom. Almost there, Scarlett, just hang on." He wasn't just doing a job. He was keeping my soul tethered to my body. In his calm, I found a reflection of the stillness I'd been searching for on my yoga mat. It wasn't peaceful, but it was solid, unshakable. With a final, groaning shriek of metal, the door was peeled away. The world opened up. Hands were on me, carefully placing a cervical collar around my neck, moving me onto a backboard. The sunlight was blinding. As they lifted me onto the gurney, Ben's hand briefly covered mine. His grip was firm, warm, and reassuringly real amidst the surreal nightmare. "You're safe now," he said, his blue eyes holding mine for one more second. "You're gonna be okay." Then he was gone, swallowed up by the ongoing emergency. In the ambulance, as the EMTs hooked me up to monitors, the shock began to recede, leaving a raw, trembling vulnerability in its wake. I had been broken open again, but this time it was different. This wasn't a betrayal. It was an accident, a random, violent act of fate. And in the middle of it, a stranger with steady blue eyes had shown me a kind of strength I'd never known. Not the aggressive, corporate ambition of Christopher. Not the silent, stoic endurance I'd been practicing. This was a strength that moved toward the crisis. That leaned into the pain to pull someone out of it. The ambulance doors closed, and the vehicle began to move. I closed my eyes, not in pain, but to hold onto the image of his face. The calm in the storm. The first man in a long time who had looked at me not as a problem, a victim, or a memory, but simply as a person who needed help. The impact had totaled my car. But it had also, in a way I couldn't yet understand, shattered the last of my old shell. I was lying on a gurney, bruised, bleeding, and completely vulnerable. And for the first time since my life had fallen apart, I felt not the end of something, but the terrifying, raw, wide-open possibility of a beginning. The hospital was a world of beige and bleached white, a sterile echo of the therapist's office where this had all begun. But this time, the pain was physical, quantifiable. A concussion, 2 cracked ribs, a spectacular mosaic of bruises that bloomed across my skin in shades of violet, mustard yellow, and deep plum. The doctors spoke in clinical terms: contusions, whiplash, musculoskeletal trauma. I understood these words. They were a language I could translate. It was a relief to have a hurt I could point to on a chart. My body, which had just begun to feel like my own again, was once again a foreign country, its geography rewritten by pain. Every breath was a sharp reminder of my ribs, Turning my head sent fire lancing down my neck. The simple act of walking to the bathroom was a monumental expedition. Frank visited, his face etched with worry. "Don't you even think about work," he'd ordered, placing a giant teddy bear for Chloe in the chair. My parents came, fussing and fretting, their presence a warm, familiar blanket. Chloe was brought in, her little face pale with fear until she saw I was whole, more or less. She carefully touched the cast on my wrist. "Does it hurt, Mommy?" "A little, baby," I said, pulling her close with my good arm, ignoring the protest in my ribs. "But I'm okay. I'm right here." The physical pain was a strange gift. It was so immediate, so demanding, that it eclipsed the older, deeper ache of betrayal. There was no room for emotional wallowing when simply sitting up required a 5-point plan and a grimace of determination. My world had shrunk to the 4 walls of my hospital room, and my only goal was to heal. And then, on the second day, there was a soft knock on the door. I expected a nurse. Instead, Ben, the firefighter, stood there. He was out of his turnout gear, dressed in a simple gray Henley and jeans. He looked ordinary and enormous. He seemed to fill the doorway, his shoulders blocking out the bright hallway lights. In his hands was a small potted orchid, its delicate purple blooms a shock of life against the sterile room. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice quieter than it had been at the crash site, but with the same grounded calm. "I hope it's okay I stopped by. I wanted to check in." I was suddenly, acutely aware of the hospital gown, the bruise on my cheek, the general state of wreckage I was in. "Oh, hi, yes, of course. Come in." He moved into the room with a quiet economy of motion and placed the orchid on the bedside table. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," I said, attempting a smile that probably looked more like a wince. "But the doctors say I'll live, thanks to you and your team." He shook his head, a humble gesture. "Just doing our job." His eyes, that clear, steady blue, scanned the room and landed on the get well cards. One, from Chloe, was a drawing of me in a hospital bed with a giant smile under a rainbow. A small smile touched his lips. "Cute kid." "She's my everything," I said, and the words didn't ache with the loneliness they usually carried. They just felt true. We talked for a few minutes. He asked about my injuries. I asked about the other driver, fine, just shaken up. The conversation was simple, surface level, but it was easy. There was no history, no baggage. He was just a kind man who'd seen me at my most terrified and vulnerable and was following up. It was a decency I hadn't experienced in a long time. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. "If you need anything when you get out, I mean, groceries, someone to change a light bulb, it can be tough with those ribs. My number's on the bottom of the pot." And then he was gone. The room felt larger, emptier, but also warmer. The orchid sat on the table, a silent, beautiful promise of kindness without strings. The accident became a demarcation line. Life before the impact and life after. After was slower, more painful, but also more intentional. Weeks passed. I was home, navigating life one careful, painful movement at a time. The yoga mat was rolled up, my body wasn't ready. My world was my cottage, my daughter, and the slow, meticulous process of physical healing. I thought of Ben sometimes, of his quiet offer. I never called. It felt too soon, too complicated. Then, one afternoon, when I was finally cleared to drive again, I took a trip to the bookstore. It was my first real outing alone. A test. I moved slowly through the aisles, my body still a tender, complaining thing, my mind savoring the normalcy of browsing bestsellers. I turned a corner into the cookbook section, looking for something simple I could make without too much strain, and I literally bumped into someone. "Oof, sorry," I mumbled, wincing as the impact jostled my ribs. A hand reached out to steady me. "Whoa, easy there." I looked up, into a familiar pair of blue eyes. Ben, he was holding a stack of cookbooks himself. He looked different in the soft, warm light of the bookstore. Softer. His smile was one of genuine, surprised pleasure. "Scarlett, hey, Ben." My heart did a funny little stutter, unrelated to my injuries. "Hi, how are you? How are the ribs?" His gaze was full of real concern. "Healing, slowly, I'm okay." And for the first time, I felt like I was telling the truth. "What are you doing here?" He hefted the stack of books. "My turn to host the cruise dinner next week. Trying to find something that doesn't involve charring meat on a grill. It's a high bar." He grinned, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. I laughed, a real, unforced sound that felt foreign and wonderful in my throat. A firefighter who can't grill? Isn't that a requirement? I can grill a mean burger, he protested, mock offended. But Chef Marco expects more these days. The pressure is immense. He nodded toward my empty hands. You looking for anything in particular? Something I can't mess up with one working wrist and a limited attention span, I admitted. What followed wasn't a flirtation. It was a conversation. A real, meandering, easy conversation. He recommended a book with simple, one-pot meals. I pointed out a beautiful Italian cookbook I'd always wanted to try. We talked about food, about our favorite restaurants in the city, about the perils of cooking with a 6-year-old sous chef. He mentioned his daughter, Lily, was 8. We talked about school projects and the inexplicable obsession with slime. For 20 minutes, standing in the aisle between Italian cuisine and quick and easy, I forgot I was a divorcee. I forgot I was injured. I forgot I was broken. I was just a woman talking to a kind, interesting man about cookbooks. It was the most normal I had felt in over a year. The climax wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A moment of realization that settled over me as he described a disastrous attempt at beef Wellington. I was laughing, actually laughing, and he was laughing with me. The sound of it, my laughter mixing with his, was a melody I didn't recognize from my old life. It was lighter, freer. This was what I had been missing, not just a man, but connection. Simple, human, uncomplicated connection. The kind that didn't require deciphering lies or walking on eggshells. The kind that was offered freely in a crisis and in a bookstore aisle. We eventually parted ways with a simple, "It was good to see you, Scarlett," and a "You too, Ben. Good luck with dinner." I bought my simple cookbook and drove home. The evening sun was golden, painting the lake by my cottage in hues of honey and orange. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the light dance on the water. The ice around my heart, the permafrost that had encased it since the day in the therapist's office, didn't crack with a sound. It just began to melt. A slow, gentle thawing born from a moment of normalcy, from the sound of shared laughter in a quiet bookstore. I wasn't ready for anything. I knew that. My body was still healing. My life was still a work in progress. But for the first time, the idea of a future, a real future with new sounds and new people in it, didn't feel like a betrayal of my past. It felt like a possibility. A quiet, hopeful, terrifying possibility. I walked inside, the simple cookbook in my hand feeling less like a manual for food and more like a guide to a life I was only just beginning to imagine. The cookbook sat on my kitchen counter, a silent dare, 5-ingredient dinners. It seemed like a safe enough bet. My wrist was out of the cast, though still tender. My ribs only complained if I sneezed or, apparently, if I thought about reaching for a top-shelf spice jar. The encounter in the bookstore had left a residual warmth, a faint echo of laughter that lingered in the quiet of my cottage. It was a feeling I wanted to explore, but from a safe distance. Food felt like the right medium, neutral, nourishing, uncomplicated. But a voice in my head, the one that had been trained by betrayal, whispered, "It's never just food." I fought the voice down. This wasn't about Christopher. This was about me proving I could do something normal. Something that didn't end in tears or lawyer's bills. I decided on the simplest recipe in the book, rosemary lemon chicken with roasted potatoes. It was hard to mess up. I was wrist-deep in washing potatoes when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. My heart did that stupid, hopeful little stutter again. I wiped my hands and answered. "Scarlett, it's Ben," from the accident, and the bookstore. His voice was a low rumble, even through the phone. I leaned against the counter, a smile tugging at my lips. The cookbook expert. "Hi, how was the beef Wellington?" A rich laugh echoed down the line. "A historic disaster. We ordered pizza, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm off shift tomorrow and I'm making my famous, well, infamous chili for the crew. I always make a giant pot. I was wondering if you and your daughter might want me to drop some off. No pressure at all. It's a lot of chili." It was a kind offer, a neighborly offer, and it was also a test. Did I let someone in? Did I accept a simple kindness from a man? The paranoid, wounded part of me screamed danger. It constructed elaborate scenarios. He'd show up with chili and an agenda. He'd pity me. It would be awkward. I'd have to invite him in and my house would be a mess and I'd say something stupid. But the newer, quieter part of me, the part that had laughed in a bookstore, whispered, "It's just chilly." I took a breath. "That's really kind of you, Ben. We'd love that." The next evening, the aroma of my simple lemon chicken filled the house. It was a clean, honest smell. Chloe was setting the table, meticulously placing forks on the wrong side of the plates. My heart was doing a nervous tap dance against my healing ribs. This was stupid. It was just a food drop-off. The doorbell rang. Chloe sprinted for it. "I'll get it." I smoothed my sweater, took a steadying breath, and followed. Ben stood on the porch, holding a massive, still-bubbling pot of chili, a loaf of crusty bread tucked under his arm, and a smaller container in his other hand. He looked wonderfully out of place, a giant on my modest doorstep holding a feast. "Delivery," he said, his smile hesitant. "You brought a whole pot," I exclaimed, moving to hold the door open. "I thought you meant a container?" "I got carried away," he admitted, stepping inside. He stopped just past the threshold, taking in the bright yellow living room. "Whoa, you painted." "I had some feelings to work through," I said, a wry edge to my voice. He nodded slowly, a look of understanding in his eyes. "It's a good color, happy." He looked down at Chloe, who was staring up at him with wide eyes. "You must be Chloe, I'm Ben. I brought you something less spicy." He handed her the smaller container. "Mac and cheese, from the box, the good kind." Chloe's face lit up. "You're the fireman who saved my mommy?" Ben's cheeks reddened slightly. "I had some help. Can I put this chili on the stove?" What was supposed to be a 30-second handoff at the door turned into, well, it turned into dinner. He insisted we try the chili. I insisted he try my chicken. We ended up with a bizarre, wonderful fusion feast at my kitchen table. Chloe chattered nonstop, telling Ben about her teacher, her friends, the blanket fort we'd built. He listened with genuine interest, asking her questions, making her laugh. And I watched. I watched this large, calm man fit himself into my small, brightly colored world. He didn't try to dominate the conversation. He didn't look around my house with judgment. He just was, present, authentic. After dinner, Chloe ran off to watch a movie, leaving a pile of dishes in the sink. Ben immediately started clearing the table. "Oh no, you don't have to do that," I protested, grabbing for a plate. Our hands brushed. A simple, accidental touch. But it sent a jolt through me, a live wire of sensation I hadn't felt in years. We both froze for a fraction of a second. The air in the kitchen shifted, grew thick and charged. "I've got it," he said softly, his eyes holding mine. "You cooked, I'll clean, it's the rule." "Whose rule?" I asked, my voice a little breathless. "Mine," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. So I let him. I leaned against the counter, watching him move around my kitchen. He was surprisingly graceful for a man his size, filling the sink with soapy water, scrubbing the pot with a focus I found utterly captivating. This was his positive trait, the one the algorithm had randomized, is an amazing cook and loves to host dinners. But it was more than that. It was an innate generosity, a desire to nourish, to take care. We started talking, really talking, not the surface-level bookstore chat. He told me about losing his wife, Lily's mother, to a swift and brutal cancer 4 years ago. He spoke of the grief not with drama, but with a quiet, profound respect for its weight. He told me about raising a little girl while working a job that could turn tragic in a heartbeat. He spoke of fear and hope and the small, daily act of choosing to move forward. In return, I told him about Christopher, the golf instructor, the flinch, the painful, paper-cut divorce. The words came easier than they ever had with my therapist. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep, empathetic understanding. The climax of the evening wasn't a kiss. It was a moment of shared silence. The dishes were done. The kitchen was clean. The movie from the other room had ended. We were just standing there, in the soft light of the overhead lamp, surrounded by the lingering smells of chili and rosemary chicken. "I should go," he said, but he made no move to leave. "You don't have to," I heard myself say. He looked at me, and the air between us was so full of unsaid things it was a miracle we could still breathe. I saw the want in his eyes, clear and honest, but I also saw the patience, the absolute, unwavering refusal to push. He took a step closer, not to me, but to the counter, and picked up a pen. He wrote something on a napkin. His number, but he'd already given it to me. "That's my number," he said, a small, shy smile on his face. "In case you need anything, or if you just want to talk, or if you ever want to try and bake something that might end in a flour fight. He looked up, his blue eyes serious. No pressure, Scarlett, just an option. And with that, he left. The door closed softly behind him. I stood in my quiet kitchen, holding the napkin. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was better. It was a choice. He was putting the ball entirely in my court, respecting my fragile state, my complicated history, my need for control. I looked around. The house was warm. It smelled of good food and clean dishes. My daughter was safe and happy. And for the first time since my world had collapsed, the future didn't feel like a terrifying blank page. It felt like a recipe. A little scary, yes. Potential for disaster, absolutely. But also the possibility of creating something nourishing, something joyful, something entirely new. I picked up the pen he'd used. Below his number, I wrote one word on the napkin. Okay. The napkin with his number and my singular, okay, stayed taped to my refrigerator, a tiny white flag of surrender to possibility. For a week, it was just a piece of paper. I'd look at it while making coffee, a little jolt of nerves and something else, anticipation, zinging through me. I didn't call. I didn't text. I just let the idea of it exist in my kitchen, a quiet potential among the grocery lists and Chloe's drawings. He didn't contact me either. He was keeping his word. No pressure. The first move was mine. It started, as things often did now, with a need to prove something to myself. The success of the lemon chicken had emboldened me. I decided to bake cookies, not from a slice and bake tube, real, from-scratch chocolate chip cookies for Chloe's school bake sale. It was such a normal mom thing to do, a thing I'd never done before because I was always too busy, too tired, too something. I was halfway through, covered in flour, my kitchen looking like a powdered sugar bomb had gone off, when I realized the recipe called for a hand mixer, which I did not own, of course. I stared at the recipe, then at the bowl of dense, unmixable cookie dough. Failure loomed. Chloe's disappointed face flashed in my mind. The old me would have cried. The new me, the one who had survived car crashes and heartbreaks, just sighed in frustration. My eyes drifted to the napkin on the fridge. No pressure, Scarlett, just an option. Before I could talk myself out of it, I took a picture of the disastrous bowl of dough and texted it to him. Scarlett, is there a fire code violation for attempted baking? I think I've created a structural integrity hazard. The 3 little dots appeared almost instantly. Then, Ben, whoa, that's a level 3 dough emergency. Do not approach without proper equipment. Stand by. Backup is en route. 20 minutes later, his truck pulled into my driveway. He emerged not with flowers, but with a toolbox-sized kit of baking supplies, a stand mixer, a silicone spatula, and a brand new bag of chocolate chips. The pros don't mess around, he said, hefting the mixer onto my counter with a grin. What followed was the opposite of a romantic, serene baking experience. It was a comedy of errors. Ben, for all his prowess with chili, was apparently a baking novice. He misread cream the butter and sugar as whip them into a frenzy, sending a plume of white powder into the air that dusted us both like a light snowfall. I burst out laughing, a real, deep, unforced laugh that felt like it had been waiting years to escape. You're worse than I am. I'm following the instructions, he protested, wiping flour from his eyebrow. We were a mess. The kitchen was a war zone, but we were laughing. We fought over the correct way to measure flour, scoop and sweep. No, spoon and level. He accidentally dropped a chunk of cold butter down the back of my shirt. I retaliated by flicking a gob of dough at him, which stuck to his cheek. It escalated from there. What began as a rescue mission devolved into a full-blown flour fight. We were 2 adults, covered in sticky dough and white powder, chasing each around the kitchen island like kids, laughing until our sides ached. Chloe, drawn by the noise, came running in and was immediately recruited as my accomplice, armed with a handful of chocolate chips. This was the joint activity the parameters had promised. Failed baking attempts that end in a flour fight. But it wasn't a checkbox on a list. It was magic. It was the most fun I'd had in a decade. It was unscripted, messy, and perfectly, wonderfully imperfect. The climax of the scene wasn't the baking. It was the cleanup. The cookies were finally in the oven, filling the house with a divine, buttery smell. The 3 of us were collapsed on the floor, leaning against the cabinets, surrounded by the evidence of our culinary crime scene. We were a glorious mess. Chloe was nestled against my side, half asleep, clutching a handful of chocolate chips she'd saved from the dough. Ben sat beside me, his shoulder warm against mine. A streak of flour was smudged across his forehead. He looked at peace. Happy. "I haven't done that since forever," he said quietly, his voice a soft rumble in the warm, fragrant kitchen. "Me neither," I admitted. My heart was full in a way I didn't recognize. It wasn't the frantic, anxious love of my marriage, always wondering if it was enough. This was a steady, warm glow, a sense of rightness. He turned his head to look at me. The laughter was gone from his eyes, replaced by something deeper, more serious. The air grew still. The only sounds were the hum of the oven and Chloe's soft breathing. "Scarlett," he began, his voice low. I knew what was coming. A declaration. A move. The moment the scene was supposed to turn romantic, and I panicked. The warmth vanished, replaced by the cold grip of old fear. My breath hitched. I could feel myself pulling back, retreating behind the familiar, safe walls of my own solitude. The ghost of Christopher's betrayal, the memory of how trust could be used as a weapon, rose up between us like a shield. Ben saw it. He saw the shutters come down in my eyes. He didn't look hurt. He looked understanding. He nodded slowly, a silent acceptance of my boundaries. He didn't push. He didn't try to convince me. Instead, he reached out, not for my hand, but for a stray chocolate chip that had stuck to my sleeve. He picked it off and popped it in his mouth. "The cookies are burning," he said, his tone light, effortlessly shifting the mood and saving me from my own fear. He was right. A faint acrid smell was mixing with the sweet aroma. We scrambled up, opening the oven to a cloud of smoke and a batch of cookies with charcoal bottoms. We looked at each other, and the tension broke. We started laughing again, a softer, more intimate laughter this time. We salvaged what we could, scraping off the burnt parts, and ate the warm, gooey centers right there over the sink. He left not long after, with a container of semi-successful cookies and a promise to return my mixer. The door closed, and I was alone again in my quiet, flour-dusted house. But I didn't feel alone. I felt accompanied, understood. He had seen my fear, he had seen me retreat, and he hadn't run. He hadn't gotten angry, he just stayed. He'd given me space within the togetherness. It was a new kind of strength. Not the force of a hurricane, but the steady, reliable pressure of the tide. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. A woman with flour in her hair and a smudge of chocolate on her chin. A woman who was still scared, but who was learning, slowly, how to be brave again. The cookies for the bake sale were a disaster, but the afternoon was a perfect, messy, beautiful success. It wasn't about the romance. It was about the repair. And for the first time, I believed that my heart, like the burnt cookies, might still have something sweet and worthwhile left to offer. The first snow of the season dusted the lakefront in a quiet, white hush. From the window of my small cottage, the world looked clean. New. The vibrant yellow of my living room walls seemed to glow brighter against the white backdrop outside. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of pine and cinnamon from the tree Chloe and I had decorated just last night. It was our first Christmas in the new old house. Our first Christmas as just us. But we weren't just us. Ben's truck was a familiar sight in my driveway now. Its presence didn't send a jolt of anxiety through me anymore. It sent a wave of warmth, a feeling of coming home. After the flower fight, something had settled between us. The fear was still there, a quiet hum in the background, but it was no longer the conductor of my orchestra. I was learning to play a new song. He was in the kitchen now, as he often was, orchestrating a breakfast that was far more elaborate than my usual toast and cereal. The sizzle of bacon and the rich scent of coffee were the soundtrack to our weekend mornings. Chloe was his dedicated, if easily distracted, sous chef, proudly stirring a bowl of pancake batter with intense concentration. I leaned against the doorway, watching them. This was the new normal. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. Ben looked over his shoulder and caught me watching. A slow, easy smile spread across his face, the one that reached his eyes and made little crinkles at the corners. "She's a natural," he said, nodding toward Chloe. "She gets it from her mother," I deadpanned. He laughed, a sound that felt as integral to my home now as the creak of the floorboards. "The woman who started a level 3 dough emergency? I doubt that. This was us. Easy, teasing, solid." The memory of Christopher was still a part of me, a scar tissue that would always be there. But the pain was a phantom limb now, a memory of an ache, not the ache itself. He was a chapter I had read, absorbed, and closed. The bitterness had been washed away, not by time alone, but by the constant, gentle drip of new, better experiences. By a man who showed up with chili and stayed to wash dishes. By a little girl who was learning that family could look different and still be whole. Ben flipped a pancake with an expert flick of his wrist. "So, I was thinking," he said, his tone casual. "The firehouse is having its New Year's Eve party. It's kind of a zoo. Lots of kids, bad punch, someone always burns the meatballs. You and Chloe should come." It was an invitation into his world, the heart of his life. I felt a familiar prickle of fear. The fear of new people, of questions, of being the divorcee with the firefighter. The fear of things going wrong. But I looked at Chloe, who was now attempting to pour batter into shapes that looked nothing like pancakes. I looked at Ben, who was watching me, his offer hanging in the air between us, no pressure, just an open door. I didn't overthink it. I didn't consult my fears. "We'd love to," I said, and I meant it. The climax of my story wasn't a dramatic reunion or a passionate declaration. It was this: a quiet Saturday morning, a simple acceptance, a decision to step into a future that was uncertain and messy and potentially wonderful. Later, after breakfast, we went for a walk by the frozen lake. Chloe ran ahead, trying to catch snowflakes on her tongue. Ben and I walked slowly behind, our gloved hands swinging between us. The world was silent except for the crunch of our boots on the snow. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "I know it probably isn't what you pictured for yourself." I looked out at the vast, white expanse of the lake, at my daughter joyful dance, at the strong, kind man beside me. "No," I said softly, "it's not." I squeezed his hand. "It's better." He stopped walking and turned to face me. The world was so still. Snowflakes caught in his dark hair. His blue eyes were serious. "I'm not him, Scarlett. I will never be him. My promises aren't made to be broken." It was the closest he'd ever come to a real declaration. And it wasn't about love. It was about character. It was about the bedrock truth of who he was. "I know," I said. And I did. I knew it in my bones, in my healed ribs, in my cautiously hopeful heart. I stood on my toes and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, but of quiet certainty. A seal on a promise we were both making. That night, after he'd gone home and Chloe was asleep, I stood in my living room, looking at the Christmas tree. Its lights twinkled, reflecting in the dark window. I saw my reflection superimposed on the glass, a woman, alone in a quiet room, but not lonely. I thought about the woman I was a year ago. The woman in the therapist's office, her world shattering from a single text. I had thought that was the defining moment of my life, the end of everything. I was wrong. It was the beginning. It was the first, painful contraction of a new life. A life I had to build myself from the ground up. I had to tear down the old structures, paint over the painful memories, and learn how to breathe on my own. I had to fall apart completely before I could understand how I was meant to be put back together. The journey hadn't been about finding a new man to replace the old one. It had been about finding myself, the pharmacist, the mother, the woman who could survive a car crash, a broken heart, and a flower fight, the woman who was strong enough to be vulnerable again. Ben wasn't my salvation. He was my companion. He was the person I had chosen to walk with into this new, uncharted territory. And I was his. I picked up a photo from the mantel. It was a picture of Chloe and me, taken a few weeks ago. We were both laughing, our heads thrown back, real joy etched on our faces. We looked happy. We were happy. I am Scarlett Evans. I am a pharmacist. I am a mother. I am a survivor. And my story isn't about being left. It's about how I began again. The future was still a blank page, but I was no longer afraid to write in it. I put the photo back, smiled at my reflection in the glass, and turned out the lights.